Now this is a little awkward because when we came, we totally rearranged the agenda so that my first sentence assumes that we had watched a 20-minute DVD, you know, on solitary confinement, which was kind of very general. And then we decided that after this wonderful food, and I appreciate the fact, being of Irish rather than German extraction, that there were lots of potatoes. And I have never addressed a group seated in such a comfortable chair. So if in mid-talk I just sort of drift off.
Well, Germans like potatoes too.
I think it's a shared poverty in our histories. So, as I said, my first sentence starts out assuming we had watched the DVD, but I think I'll still use it because I am simply presuming that most of you do know the kind of canned history of the first penitentiary and the role of the Quakers. And to some extent, the DVD goes on, it is contemporary, but sort of comments on, you know, it was not entirely their doing. And, but at the same time, I'm very much aware that we have to have some history in order to have a sense of where solitary confinement came. And it was closely related with the history of our own country. I mean, it's not that there hasn't been solitary confinement in other places. So I really began by saying we need some additional historical background on solitary confinement beyond pinning it on the Quakers. Because we live in the United States where our roots were and continue to be conflicted and contradictory. We just have to live with that. And that is, almost immediately in the new nation, the British bloody code of capital and corporal punishment was challenged. Not only were murder and treason, and you must realize our founding fathers were acutely aware of the treason part of that, but a range of property offenses brought the offender to the gallows. Property. And the historical basis for that was earlier, the British landed gentry and the rising mercantile classes faced the unrest of the poor and the landless, and they were convinced only the threat of death would protect their property. So the early reformers in the New Republic, which included Nathan Dane, I thought I tucked him in because that's Dane County. We were named for Nathan Dane. And sought a substitute for the bloody code, including the abolition of the death penalty. I just brought this folder, so early, late. And they were only partially successful. And so, very simply, we have lived with the bloody code to the present day in our history of lynchings and drones, as well as our death rows. Now, the new legislators, without the alternative of death, were faced with the necessity of finding ways to control the perceived dangerous criminals. Now, critically, it was sought within the context of a deeply embedded system of slavery that accepted the necessity of breaking the will of a new slave by the use of flogging and hunger. For the reformers, it appeared that the needed control might be achieved benevolently. They were always using that term, achieve benevolently, by the use of solitary confinement and the diet of bread and water. Taylor, this is a wonderful, just think of me as Taylor addressing the Virginia House of Delegates in 1796, because he sang the praises of their new penitentiary and solitary confinement. A silence surrounds him, prolonged and uninterrupted as that of a grave. During all this time, he sustains the torture of having nothing to do, and his mind is compelled to brood over his past conduct and the present situation. Must not his mind be a sentimental hell where pangs the most exquisite rack his soul? Will he not with bitter repose implore the pardon of heaven and resolve on reformation of conduct? And will not then the penitentiary house be to him a school of virtue? Now, in the real world of prison building, as we know so well, this new penitentiary house turned out to have doors that didn't fit, no heat, and within a few years was so overcrowded that they placed two men together in a single cell. Clearly, it did not become a school of virtue. Now, New York, one of the major reformers of the day was Matthew Carson, a wealthy businessman, the head of the New York Bible Society, and as well the Society for the Prevention of Pauperism. In the Society's 1822 report, he wrote that felons whose minds should be broken on the rack and wheel instead of their bodies can only have their obstinate and guilty principles crushed and destroyed by severe treatment. In absolute and compulsory solitude, that audacious spirit of resistance to the established order of society, which drove him to the commission of every outrage, gives place to the mortifying sense of his weakness and dependence. And he ardently desires, as the first of blessings, a return to that very society from which his crimes banished him. The reform was tried at Auburn Prison in New York. 83 men were placed in solitary without work or recreation. Several went mad or committed suicide. Most of the others were pardoned when the experiment was abandoned. But the state of New York retains solitary confinement, stating its purpose is to produce the entire submission and obedience of any prisoner. And out of this failed experiment at Auburn, the Modern Penitentiary was born in the new Sing Sing prison. Inmates worked together during the days and were locked in their cells during the night, with solitary confinement as a disciplinary punishment. Waupun, coming home, Waupun, with the first cell block built in 1853, continues Sing Sing's tradition to the present day. In 1957, as a kind of a portent of the future, Waupun built a 50-bed special management unit for malcontents. And as the Wisconsin Department of Corrections noted in its history for the development of the Supermax prison, they say, during the 90s, prisons became more dangerous due to overcrowded conditions and longer inmate sentences. In a 10-year period, they note the average sentence increased from 6 years to 14 years. That, of course, is thanks to truth in sentencing. By 1998, Waupun had a 180-bed segregation unit. When I visited Waupun during this period, as you passed by the hole, or the greenhouse, as it was told, you were followed by a chorus of voices calling out in rage or in appeal. Looks like some of you have had that experience of going past the greenhouse. Now, we just had an election. Following a nationwide trend in 1999, Governor Tommy Thompson built a $47.5 million 500-bed solitary confinement Supermax for the most dangerous and destructive, or as he would say, the worst of the worst. In reality, it contained the retarded and mentally ill, a few juveniles, violent offenders, those who had challenged the administration, suspected gang members, and others perceived as potential troublemakers. If you want to read the description, the official description of who may go to the Supermax. Now, I have a, you can wave it at them.
You will get these later.
Mm-hmm. It was decided that you really shouldn't start looking through them while I'm talking. That was one of the things we organized at the beginning. Bill Loon, with his sizing up Supermax, had as its subtitle, "Wisconsin's newest prison represents a triumph of politics over penological principles." Mm-hmm. And a quote in the cover by Wardenberg, who insists his prison is not a high-tech torture chamber. Mm-hmm. So it was very much aware. And it's an excellent article, which you will have, small print, that on the process it gives us our Supermax. And he emphasizes the resistance many of the professionals in corrections on the building of the Supermax. This did not come out of the Department of Corrections. As well as the eagerness of the mayors and people in the small Wisconsin rural towns to have a prison to provide jobs and service contracts. 3 towns competed for this prison. And when I was describing the process in one of my classes, one of my students explained that one of the mayors was her uncle. It was grassroots. The DLC filmed a video at the opening of the Supermax with the mayor of Boscobel rejoicing in the jobs and thousands of dollars that would be coming to the little town. Actually, neither lasting jobs nor contracts ever arrived. And I'm sure there may be people here at the open house that was hosted by the DLC for the Supermax. Some of you will remember or may have participated in the protest of members of the faith community and others deeply opposed to the construction. And Father Jim Murphy, who is a MEP member, the Task Force on Money, Education, and Prisons, uttered an Old Testament-based curse on the building, not the people, on the building. So just know if you are visiting the Supermax, you are visiting a cursed building.
Yeah, I was there that day.
I knew, I had a feeling that this would be. And by 2002, the 1999 it's built, by 2002, seeking invisibility after a federal lawsuit that excluded all of mentally ill and youthful inmates, the Supermax became the more innocent sounding Wisconsin Secure Program Facility. And in 2007, in other words, we didn't need it. In 2007, they converted a 101-bed transition unit designed for the few inmates actually who ever made it through the levels. So it was essentially unused to house general population transferred from other facilities. And that's now grown to 204 inmates. So that basically we have, at present, 13 years later, there are essentially 2 prisons at Boscobel. The one originally was Wisconsin Secure Program Facility. I'm using the abbreviations in the DLC as WSPF. And the other, the Wisconsin General Population Facility. So what we now have, we've retained the Supermax with 290 cells for the worst of the worst, and 211 cells for a mixed general population. Now, this is the very latest count. On November 23rd, 2012, there were 273 men housed in the cells built for prolonged solitary confinement. And with increasing awareness that our practices of prolonged solitary confinement are in violation of the international laws against torture. And the first congressional hearing on solitary confinement was held this year, the first hearing. And Anthony Graves, an innocent man who had spent 18 years in solitary confinement, told those present, solitary confinement does one thing. It breaks a man's will to live, and he ends up deteriorating. He's never the same person again. The past lives in the present. Wisconsin's own Torture in Your Backyard, which was the title of the DVD we would have shown, is located in Boscobel, just down the road. And I end with, what can we do?
Thank you so much, Sister. We'll open it up for questions now.
I have two questions at the moment, Esther. One of them is just a little bit how you got into prison work, actually, because I've never heard that. And I believe I've heard you say that when you started in prison work, no one was put into solitary for longer than maybe a month at most. And now, you know, I'm visiting men who are in solitary for a year, and know many men who were in Boscobel, say, for 7 years or 14 years. So if you could speak to those two things, that'd be great.
I had absolutely no idea that I would end up this way. I'm a sociologist. I was working on my doctorate, and we had a seminar that took us through DC, Department of Corrections facilities. And they included the women's facility. And I was fascinated by this is guided tour, you know, the 75-cent real guided tour. And I was fascinated by what really was going on behind. And my research could never be done now. There are too many restrictions, privacy, and so forth. But I had the opportunity to go to the Women's Institution with the opportunity to interview every one of the women with complete access both to their regular files and the confidential files. And originally I had the permission to also interview the staff. See, I wanted to understand the prison as a system of power, but to see it from every perspective. Well, the women, and I worked very hard on, this is a very comfortable chair, but so when we would be interviewing, I would have chairs so that we were always parallel, except when the woman came in, I stood up and greeted her. In other words, everything is possible. And I really asked the women how you made it in prison. I had a set of very specific questions, but sometimes if you just got it started, I knew I could fit the questions into the thing. And I took complete notes. Now, it wasn't long before they decided I really couldn't interview the staff. But that was all right because I went over at lunch every day and sat with the staff and heard the conversations and, asked questions. So out of it came the dissertation. But one of the things that I had said to the women was, I can't, as a researcher, there wasn't a thing, I couldn't do anything in relationship to Occoquan. But I said, I made a commitment to make it visible. And out of that came a book, which is Making It in Prison, the Square, the Life, and the Cool. Which is where the dynamics of the women's adaptation. But I also was aware of how critical legislation was. They came out of politics, and it is politics. You have two levels. You have the close personal kinds of relationships that the prison ministry can do. But you also know that to make differences in the system, you have to work on legislation. And so much of what I've worked on has been legislation. I've done research and that means with the I've done research with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I've done research for the Department of Corrections in Alaska. I've been on legislative council on legislation. So that's and talking and talking and talking.
And that second question about the increasing use of solitary compared to when you started.
I think the thing is, in an ordinary prison, you get 10 days, 20 days, 30 days. You might, if you got into a real fight, more. If you actually attacked a correctional officer, you could have another sentence. That would, but the whole was basically pretty short. And sometimes it was just long enough to, get two people separated and calm down, and they could come out and you wouldn't have another fight. So, but not too long ago, I was looking at the penalties in the guidebooks for the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, where they would be the same kind of thing, would be a year in segregation. It's just gone up and up. And then, of course, you see, historically, you had solitary confinement with those first penitentiaries. But you didn't, you had SEG, you had the whole, but it was short. Mm-hmm. Then, now what we built at Boscobel was the original penitentiary, solitary confinement. And that's why I gave you those two wonderful quotations where they knew absolutely what solitary confinement would do to a person. That was a long answer. Sorry.
No, it's a great answer.
I understand the at least I think I understand the politics of prisons and building solitary. More beds, bigger prisons, somebody gets
money.
more money. What about us in the general that aren't in prison? What makes solitary confinement so compelling? Because somebody makes the decision to put a prisoner in solitary and a bunch of other somebody says that's okay with me, because that, I mean, that's the only way that it continues to exist. So what are our human characteristics that this appeals to us?
Well, I think part of it is, and I've used the term visible or invisible a couple of times, is the very nature of our penal system is to be invisible. I mean, if you're driving up north, you'll go past Columbia, but you don't really see it. You go downtown, you go around the square, and the jail is there, and you don't see it. I mean, you can't look in, you don't see it. So there is a sense in which it's profoundly invisible to us, and it's made invisible, it's behind walls. We don't see it, and it's really only, for many people, the first time that someone in their family or their friends ends up in prison that it becomes visible. I mean, how often, now luckily I was just saying to Carol, the effort by Wisdom to try to make some changes has actually made the newspaper. But about the only time you see anything in the newspaper is the trial and the sentence, but then the whole thing disappears. The whole penal system disappears, goes away for most of us, unless something has happened to make it touch us. And of course, for me, it was the women at Occoquan. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, you mentioned Auburn. As far as I know, that is still alive and well and still operating, so you can imagine what the conditions are like there. Let's see, also, another point I'd like to make, you mentioned the Quakers. Actually, in those days, I think when the Quakers set up their prison, they sincerely believed that it was a major reform and that was a major advancement, and vis-a-vis the other prisons of that age, it probably was what they came up with in Philadelphia. Another question, what about, I know in solitary confinement there's a lot of prisoners that go there voluntarily because for whatever reason they fear revenge or retaliation from the general population. I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Well, that's, they're in this lovely world of technicals. There's administrative segregation. And most facilities that of any size have administrative segregation, and part of it is the reality of a prison, and so you have power structures inside the prison. When I use the term with the women, the square, the square, the cool, and the life. The square were the women who had killed their husbands. Sorry. They would get a long sentence, but there would have been nothing in their lives that ever gave them any sense that they would ever go to prison. So, long sentence, but basically square. Their sense of themselves would be as a good person. The cool were the women that were professional, kind of prided them. I remember a woman, being very proud of the fact that she was a second-story burglar, because they hadn't assumed a woman could, that was a pretty skilled operation. So, so you had the women who were in the drug and so forth, and then the women in the life had grown up on the streets. Their mothers were from the streets. They survived with prostitution and petty thief and so forth. And they just brought that world in the life There was the life on the street and the life in the prison. Well, now you put together the square and the cool and the life. What happens sometimes is the square are frightened. I mean, and so the cool stay out. The life do things right in front of the correctional officers and end up in the seg. There are other people for whom it's the safest place to be. And that may because they were predatory in as they had been predatory out. In other words, prison is not a nice place to be. Oh, here I'm.
Would you describe sort of a day in the life of somebody in SEG?
Well, I love the warden at Boscobel, you know, at the Supermax, because he mentioned that indeed the prisoners had personal contacts during the day. The personal contact would consist of a correctional officer shoving the food through the space. So you basically are in solitary confinement, but then there is the human, and even the best architects in construction have not been able to produce a prison in which there is not some way for communication. It may be the plumbing pipes, it may be the heat vents, so it may be a little truncated, but you don't really, if you're determined, you're not deprived of contact. You have no human contact, but you have the voice. But basically, it's simply, in a sense, it's 24 hours with a light on. At Boscobel, there is some natural light, but it's up so that you never ever see anything. You've got a hole. You will have a regulated shower and so forth, but there you are.
Are you allowed, or does that vary? Allowed things in or not things in, like books or?
It depends. Now, what they also did is they would have, they had another cell where you could go for recreation, meaning you could go out, and now you go shackled, you'd go out and you could be, have recreation there. Many of the men would not go because, well, can you think of unheated in the winter? So that
They're essentially dog pens.
they're dog pens. Mm-hmm.
Well, right, and at Boscobel, it's kind of like a concrete bunker. It's maybe, I don't remember the size, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, something like that. And it's just solid concrete walls that go up very high, I mean 15 feet maybe, and there's a little slot that opens to outside air, so you can see the sky through that slot. But that's it, you just walk around in, and so you're not seeing out at all. And I was in a cell at Boscobel, Esther, where before it opened, they let people tour
that
it.
Famous tour.
Yes, and the cells are very tiny, and I thought that frosted glass that was along the top was outside light, was natural light. But a man who's currently at Columbia, who spent 7 years in one of those cells, said it's not natural light. It's fluorescent light, and they can control it. So they're never, at least the way basketball was set up at that point, you never saw outside except this tiny slit. But also, not to go on too long, but basketball has been in many ways the nightmare of this. But and Jerry could speak to this, I'm sure. In other prisons, say in Columbia, in Portage, the segregation unit there, I would say, is as bad as basketball and is being used for as long amounts of time, where men are being given a 360, for instance, and it's never quiet. And the men tell me that it's never quiet except right after the food has been delivered. And where I do pastoral visits, or where Jerry does, I've never been on the unit itself, but you can hear it. And it's constant screaming and banging. If you imagine that 23 and a half hours a day, it's torture. Yeah.
Thank you. Could you say a few words about the use of solitary in other cultures, in other nations? And then is there any research that indicates that some places the populations acclimate to it better than others, or is it just hard for everybody wherever it's used?
Now, the thing is, actually, solitary, being locked in a cell is an old system of control. But the setting up in the United States of the early penitentiaries, of the famous Pennsylvania one, was kind of assumed to be an American invention, which in a way did come from the rejection of the Bloody Code. Now, the interesting thing in England with the Bloody Code was it was there, but fascinating things happened at the local level in terms of who really went to the gallows. Extenuating, they didn't call them extenuating circumstance, but everybody knew everyone. And so it seldom was actually used for minor property. But the interesting thing was, and this is where the United States, had an interesting history, was that the English got a little, the establishment got really concerned about the laxness of justice at the local level. In other words, if you really used the Bloody Code, you would have been hanging many people, and you really didn't. It was pretty stable. But then when they had the new colonies, guess what? They started transportation. And so in early Virginia, Maryland, and so forth, you had the beginning of the slave trade from Africa. The image there of the slave trade. But the English would send over for 7 years or 14-year sentences, penal servitude. So you could buy 7 or 14 years of English convicts. And the net result was that you could tighten up in England. You had a sort of a safety valve. And so bondage in someone has calculated that a fairly high percent, if you were thought of yourself as one of the first families of Virginia, there was a pretty good chance that the first person who came in bondage. Because there was a fairly large number of, and remember, when we abolished slavery, take a look at that amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime. That was when we abolished slavery, except for, if we wanted to put it that way, the American penal system.
Maybe one more question, and before we go to a question, is Janet and Tom are still here. They've actually been, and maybe other people have been, to the original penitentiary. Janet and I have been friends for a long time, and she goes on these trips, and she always sends me postcards from prison. I mean, they were in Venice this fall, and she sends me this postcard from a dungeon, So, Janet, anything you want to say about your experience? Here you have to use.
We went to the prison in Philadelphia because all the museums were closed that day. And we ended up spending almost 4 hours there. There is a wonderful audio-guided tour, and it was stunning. I had never thought about the prison system quite the way it was. It came to us that day. Cells that were totally solitary, and you might have been taken into it at night so that if by chance anybody else would see you, nobody else could see you go in. There were apparently the provisions for doing work in the cells. And I don't know how long it was before they discovered that really that wasn't going to work. And so they put a door, all the doors were to the outside, but then they've changed it. They somehow remodeled and put doors to the inside hallways. But this was a model prison whose architecture was reproduced in other parts of the world, because this was a good way to do it, or at least, yeah. The audio tour includes, one of the interesting things is the audio tour includes men who had been in the prison. It was in use until the 1970s, built in the early 19th century, 1820 something or other, I think. And in fact, by the time it closed, and what these men described, it was probably a more humane place than the prisons we have here in Wisconsin. There was a looseness about it that just does not exist here anymore. But it was really, it wasn't the first time I'd been in prison, but it was the first time I'd spent quite that much time there. It was pretty fascinating. The prison in the Doge's Palace is a whole altogether different thing. And the better prison rooms are on the higher floors where it doesn't get wet. And the farther down you go, the wetter it gets, with all of the attendant illness and discomfort that goes with it. Who was the famous?
Don Juan.
Don Juan was one of the famous inmates who escaped at least twice.
Well, Esther, maybe if I can have the last question here. You ended your talk by saying, so what can we do? So I wonder if you could direct us, what would you have us do?
Well, part of it one of the crucial things is you said you had the 4 hours that made a difference. Part of it is for it not to be invisible. And of course, all of our institutions have a seg, have a hole. And I know in the women's institution, one of the newer buildings, they have their very own supermax. And I'll always remember being there when a really very small young woman was coming down the hall to an interview, again, shackled. I mean, one of the things in the prison system is when women fight for equality, what it means is they're treated as men. So here she was with all the, everything that would assume a very large, strong man. So part of it is visibility. I mean, that you become aware of, you know, the Wisconsin Department of Corrections has a website, and one of the things that you might do sometime is just go in and get the printout on the population and take a look at the difference between the capacity and the number of people that are there. Now, one nice thing about the Supermax is it has space. If you look at the other institutions, they are overcrowded. And you keep wondering, if your capacity is 700 and you have 865, you wonder where the 165 are. So that, now this is a terrible thing to say, you realize, when you're looking at budgets, is don't push for cutting the budgets of Department of Corrections if you're concerned about the condition of the prisoners. What you have to do is work on things like sentencing. I'm a little bit worried about the fact that they're breaking up the union in the prisons. I'm not sure what that's going to mean. Now, Walker, I don't think, was even thinking about what it would mean if you eliminated unions, public. So a lot of it is to be aware politically. The other part is you do have to have contact, or you get all tangled up in the policy legislation and you forget about the people that are there. So those of you who are in prison ministry where you're getting a direct relationship, it will keep reminding you what you're doing when you're nagging at the legislature. But it's also true that when I just said courtesy of truth in sentencing, that we got the Supermax. But it's to go to every legislative hearing, being aware you may not make a dent, but just keep at that. You were not being totally kind to Doyle, but he made a little tiny difference in sentencing. And I was reading that the bill that passed the Wisconsin legislature under Walker eliminated all of those tiny steps that had been made in the truth in sentencing.
Do you want to pass out those? Yeah, okay. Kate's going to pass out the handouts.
Although we had such a great turnout that we probably won't have enough, but
You could email Jerry or myself, and I'll get them to you. So.
And I apologize that the print is small, but
Before I offer the benediction, let me just say how great this has been. What a wonderful night. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Sister Esther, for coming here. And let me just say, as to Esther's point, the people in this room are wonderfully positioned to do what Esther says, because there are people in this room that go to prison every week, sometimes twice a week. And there are people in this room that are down at the legislature once a week or twice a week. And we're together in this. And the stories of the men and women we hear inside are what motivates us to be involved in things like Moses and wisdom. So it's in this group that we have the expertise to tell the stories that need to be told. And so I'm so proud of all of you. Betty?
Do you feel like there's a movement beginning to come together?
Well, we hope. There's been some really positive stuff. There was, in today's State Journal, there was a great editorial saying that, and Esther's right. It's not that we spend too much money in prisons. We spend it in very much the wrong ways. And we got to start trying to turn that around. Let me offer a benediction. If you would take your leftovers with you, then the Christians in the room can clean up. Okay. Let me offer.
rephrase that.
The members of First Congregational United Church of Christ would be happy to clean up. Let us pray. God loves us, and we are called to love each other. God forgives us, and we are called to forgive each other. Go in peace. Amen. And thanks to Tim for being our videographer.
I hope it was what you wanted.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sister, hi. I haven't done things legislatively, but I go every week to Oak Hill.
Oh, yes, and it's got a new warden.
Oh, is he?
Superintendent.
Oh, who is it? Do you know? I know that we had an interim down there after Warden, the guy from Red Granite was interim warden.